Thanks for listening. Every time you listen, you are a blessing and encouragement to us as we leave the legacy of faith by journaling through the Bible. This is episode 527, season 1 of the Family Bible Journey Old Testament podcast. Today we're looking at Jeremiah chapters 46 and 47. The title of today's podcast is Promised Redemption. And our key verses for today, Jeremiah chapter 46, verses 25 to 28. But before we read our key verses, for those who are reading with us through the Bible or journaling through the Bible, you'll see that these 4 verses are the exception to this section, because in this section of the prophet of Jeremiah, we are going to see God's condemnation of the many neighbors and enemies of God's people, Israel, who are also going to be overthrown by the Babylonians. It isn't as if Israel was singled out for overthrow, but rather all of these nations who had access to the gospel, to the prophets of Israel and the word that had gone out in their midst, they chose evil ways. They chose to follow other gods. And so they are all going to fall under the Lord's judgment. But here in these particular verses, we hear that God's faithfulness is going to be maintained and that he is ultimately going to deliver his people from their sin. And so we read, beginning in verse 26, I will deliver them into the hand of those who seek their life, into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and his officers. Afterward, Egypt shall be inhabited as in the days of old, declares the Lord. But fear not, O Jacob my servant, nor be dismayed, O Israel. For behold, I will save you from far away, and your offspring from the land of their captivity. Jacob shall return and have quiet and ease, and none shall make him afraid. Fear not, O Jacob my servant, declares the Lord, for I am with you. I will make a full end of all the nations to which I have driven you. But of you I will not make a full end. I will discipline you in just measure, and I will by no means leave you unpunished. This is the word of the Lord. So in chapter 46, 47, 48, and 49, we are going to hear God's promised judgment on the nations around Israel. And then in chapter 50 and 51, we are going to hear how God is going to punish the oppressors, how Babylon herself is going to be overthrown by the Lord's wrath. Before we're going to hear a concluding chapter in Jeremiah chapter 52, which is a summary of the entirety of the book of Jeremiah, in particular the fall of Jerusalem for the idolatry that had taken hold of the hearts of God's people. But here in chapter 46, we hear of God's particular judgment upon Egypt. And Egypt is that nation who had enslaved God's people for 400 years. Egypt had been a world power in her time, and her people had put their faith in many false gods, even worshiping the Pharaoh as a god. Their earthly success, their affluence, their prosperity, their power, their military might made them worship themselves. And we as God's people today, especially those living in 21st century America, we need to be aware of the temptation that we also have to put our faith in power and wealth and affluence and influence and military might, because these are seductive false gods of the world that we live in. And Egypt was guilty of worshiping them all. My note on chapter 46, it says, chapter 46 and following, God's judgment upon Israel's neighbors and enemies. And then a note on chapter 46, verses 3 to 5. It says, Egypt had been the most powerful nation and put her faith in her strength. Her strength will not save her in the end. And again, that is our human tendency, to put our faith in the things of this world instead of putting our faith in the Creator of all things. And then in verses 27 and 28, which touches on our key verses today, my note there, it says, how often we end up where we should have begun, finding our only hope in God's promises, because it is human nature to seek earthly hope and earthly help, and we will often exhaust all earthly resources and earthly hopes before we even turn to the Lord in prayer, even as God's people. And so it is good for us to acknowledge this sinful human condition that lives inside of our hearts and turn to the Lord in prayer from the very beginning of every endeavor. And in my work with our Genesis group, that's GENYSYS-group.com, or you can look us up On YouTube, just make sure that you spell it right. Look for the green letter G with a little leaf growing out of it. That's our logo. As we work with churches and congregations and Christian leaders throughout the country, we see oftentimes that churches are suffering, entire denominations are suffering for the very same sin that God warns his people against here in this passage, trusting in our earthly means, trusting in our earthly resources, majoring in the minors, neglecting and ignoring the most important matters of faith and love and charity, choosing instead to worship our institutions, worship our denominations, worship our pastors, worship whoever it is or whatever it is that we think has given us the success and the life that we enjoy. And so we want to be careful in reading this Jeremiah. Do not think that these words, these warnings apply only to the people back then, to the people who were alive thousands of years ago, as if we are somehow better, as if we are somehow different. Rather, let us learn from their mistakes instead of learning from making the very same mistakes ourselves. May we begin on our knees in prayer, as every engagement that we embark upon, as our Genesis group works with congregations, begins with a formal prayer vigil. And as I like to say to those that we're working with, if we don't begin on our knees, God will bring us to our knees. So we might as well start in prayer, seeking the Lord's direction, discerning his will in all things, because we know that if we are following where he leads, he will provide the resources that we need to accomplish his will in his work in our churches, in our families, in our communities, and in our own individual lives. And so let us begin on our knees in prayer, trusting not in ourselves or the vanity of false and earthly hopes, but rather finding our hope and our stay in the Lord and him alone. Because God promises, even in the midst of disaster, to bless his people when we turn to him in faith, following him in fear and looking to him in all things, knowing that he promises to use all things to bless us in the end. In 2011, some friends of ours started a school in Kenya with 11 students. By purchasing a farm field, a shed, and a chicken coop. And God has blessed their ministry so that now we have over 1,200 students receiving a Christian education, being cared for, protected, and cherished with God's love in Kenya. If you would like to hear their story or see how you could support the wonderful work that is being done there in Kenya through our ministry, go to the website forkenyaskids.org. That's the number 4, KENYASKIDS.org. Our blessing for today. May you always pray, knowing that this life will bring us to our knees. So we might as well start there, leaning on the Lord, his love, and his promises to save. Amen.